My sister-in-law, Isabella, accused me of being a thief in front of our entire family, trying to humiliate me over a missing heirloom. She thought she had me cornered, but she didn't know I had a legal document in my briefcase that would unravel her entire world. This is where the story truly begins, and you won't want to miss what happens. Make sure you're subscribed to see it through to the end. We're always curious. Where in the world are you all watching from today? Let us know in the comments. The soft glow of the dining room chandelier cast a warm, golden light over the table, glinting off the polished silverware and crystal glasses. It was my in-laws' 50th wedding anniversary, and the atmosphere in their stately home was one of gentle celebration. My father-in-law, Richard, a retired judge with a presence that still commanded respect, sat at the head of the table, his wife Margaret seated opposite him, looking as serene and elegant as ever. My husband, David, sat to my right, his quiet, academic nature a comforting anchor in the sometimes turbulent waters of his family. And across from me sat Isabella, David's younger sister. Isabella was a study in curated perfection. At 35, she was a part-time yoga instructor with aspirations of becoming a major lifestyle blogger. Her life seemed to be a series of perfectly filtered photographs and performative wellness routines. There was an inherent restlessness about her, a constant need to be the center of attention that often manifested as thinly veiled digs at my own, much quieter life as a certified public accountant. To Isabella, my stable career and my comfortable, drama-free marriage to her brother were bafflingly beige. 50 years, Isabella said, raising her champagne flute. It's just incredible. I hope I can find a love like that someday. She smiled sweetly at her parents, but her eyes flickered toward David and me for a fraction of a second, a subtle reminder that, in her view, our love was somehow less grand, less worthy of celebration. We all murmured our congratulations, the mood light and convivial. Margaret, ever the gracious hostess, began telling a story about her own grandmother, a woman of formidable character who had left her a few precious pieces of jewelry. Her sapphire necklace, Margaret said, her eyes distant with memory. It was her most prized possession. She wore it to her own golden anniversary party. Isabella's eyes lit up with a familiar, acquisitive gleam. Oh, Mother, you should wear it tonight. It would be so perfect. Please, can we see it? Margaret hesitated. Oh, I don't know, dear. It's been put away for so long. Please, Isabella pressed, her voice taking on the wheedling tone of a child. It would mean so much, for Grandma. Richard chuckled. Go on, Margaret, let the girls see it. It's a special occasion. With a soft sigh, Margaret excused herself and went upstairs to her bedroom. The dinner conversation continued, but I noticed Isabella was unusually quiet, her fingers tapping impatiently on the stem of her glass. A few minutes later, Margaret returned, her expression clouded with confusion. That's odd, she said, her hand fluttering at her throat. It's not in my jewelry box. Richard frowned. Are you sure, darling? You always keep it in the velvet case at the back. I know, I looked everywhere. It's simply not there, Margaret said, her voice trembling slightly. Isabella's head snapped up. She scanned the table, her gaze landing on me with an unnerving intensity. Not there. Mother, are you certain? When was the last time you saw it? I can't recall exactly, Margaret stammered. A few months ago, perhaps. Isabella stood up slowly, her chair scraping against the hardwood floor. The theatricality of the movement silenced the table. A few months ago, she repeated, her voice low and laden with insinuation. She walked around the table until she was standing just behind my chair. I could feel the heat of her presence, the sheer force of her will to dominate the room. Antonia, she said, and my name sounded like an indictment. You were helping Mother sort through her closets last month, weren't you? For the charity drive. I turned to look up at her, my heart beginning to beat a little faster. Yes, I was. We went through some old coats and things in the hall closet. Did you go upstairs? Into her bedroom. Isabella pressed, her voice growing louder. David placed a hand on my arm. Isabella, what are you implying? I'm not implying anything, she shot back, her eyes still locked on me. I'm just asking, did you go into their bedroom, Antonia? The entire room was frozen. Richard and Margaret looked utterly bewildered, caught in the crossfire of a battle they didn't understand had begun. No, I did not, I said, my voice steady despite the tremor I felt inside. I was never upstairs. Isabella let out a short, bitter laugh. Really, that's funny because a price cell. SS family heirloom goes missing, and the only person who has recently had access and who, well, let's be honest, could use the money. The accusation hung in the air, thick and poisonous. The implication was clear. I, the sensible, stable CPA, was secretly a desperate thief. David shot to his feet. That is enough, Isabella. Apologize to my wife right now. But Isabella wasn't looking at her brother. Her eyes, filled with a cold, triumphant fire, were fixed on me. I'm just saying it's a strange coincidence. A very, very strange coincidence. The celebration was over. In its place was a gaping wound of suspicion, and I was the one holding the knife she had so expertly placed in my hand. The dining room, which had felt so warm and inviting just moments before, was now thick with a suffocating tension. Richard, his face a thunderous mask of disapproval, finally spoke, his voice carrying the weight of a courtroom gavel. Isabella, that is a monstrous accusation. You will sit down and hold your tongue. Isabella, however, was too deep in her performance to retreat. Dad, I'm just trying to be logical. The necklace is gone. Antonia was here, alone with Mom's things. What are we supposed to think? Margaret looked as though she might faint, her hand pressed to her chest. Please, children, not tonight. My husband, David, was furious, his usual academic calm completely shattered. Logical? You call this logical? You've been jealous of Antonia for 20 years, and now you're using a misplaced piece of jewelry to launch an attack on her character. It's pathetic. Jealous? Isabella scoffed, tossing her hair back. Jealous of what? Her spreadsheets? Her sensible shoes? Don't be ridiculous, David. I have a life. I'm just concerned about our family's property. While the storm raged around me, a strange and unexpected calm settled over me. I felt the initial shock and the hot sting of humiliation, but it was quickly replaced by something else. A deep, weary sense of predictability. This was not a new battle. It was simply the latest, most audacious campaign in Isabella's long-running war against me. For years, she had deployed passive aggression, backhanded compliments, and subtle manipulations to undermine me in the eyes of her parents. She resented that her intellectual, non-materialistic brother had married a woman who was not only his intellectual equal, but also financially savvy and independent. My competence, my refusal to engage in her petty dramas, was a constant affront to her. I sat there, listening to her weave her narrative of suspicion, and I thought of David's grandmother, a woman whose sharp mind and even sharper wit had never been fooled by Isabella's theatrics. It was because of that insight that she had named me, not one of her own children, as the executor of her estate. You have a clear head, Antonia, she had told me a few years before she passed, her hand frail but firm on mine. You don't get swept up in the noise. You see things for what they are. My children, they love each other, but they are blinded by sentiment. And my granddaughter, she is blinded by shiny things. The memory was so vivid it was like she was whispering in my ear. In that moment, I realized that this was not just an attack. It was an opportunity. Isabella, in her arrogance, had stumbled into a trap of her own making. She had forgotten, or more likely, had never bothered to know, the crucial details of her grandmother's final wishes. She saw only a missing necklace and a target for her resentment. She had no idea that I was the one person in the world who knew exactly where that necklace was, and why it wasn't in her mother's jewelry box. David was still arguing with her, his voice strained. You owe her an apology, Isabella, right now. I will not apologize for asking a legitimate question. I slowly raised a hand, a simple gesture, but it cut through the noise. All eyes turned to me. I looked at Isabella, not with anger, but with a detached sort of pity. She was so convinced of her own cleverness, so certain she had finally cornered me in a way I couldn't escape with quiet dignity. She wanted me to cry, to protest, to become hysterical and prove her right. I would do none of those things. I let the silence stretch for a moment, allowing the weight of her accusation to settle fully on everyone in the room. I wanted them to feel its ugliness, its baselessness. I saw the doubt flickering in Richard's eyes and the desperate hope in Margaret's that this was all a terrible mistake. I even saw a flicker of uncertainty in Isabella's own gaze, a momentary fear that she had perhaps pushed too far. It was time. I had let her build the stage and deliver her monologue. Now it was my turn to speak. I kept my voice even and low, a stark contrast to her shrill hysterics. Isabella, I began, my gaze unwavering. You are right about one thing, it is not a coincidence. A smirk played on her lips. Aha, so you admit it. I ignored her. I turned to my mother-in-law. Margaret, do you remember after Grandma passed, I was tasked with handling her estate? Margaret nodded, confused. Yes, of course, dear, you were wonderful. And Richard, I continued, turning to my father-in-law. As a judge, you know better than anyone the legal responsibilities of an executor, that they are required by law to secure all valuable assets of the estate until they can be properly distributed according to the will. Richard's expression shifted from anger to intense focus. Yes, he said slowly, that is correct. I finally turned my full attention back to Isabella, whose triumphant expression was beginning to falter. The sapphire necklace was the single most valuable item in your grandmother's estate, and as the executor, my primary duty was to protect it. I paused, letting the words sink in. Which is why, 3 months ago, I took it to be professionally appraised and then placed it in a secure safe deposit box at the bank, where it remains to this day. I have all the paperwork, of course. The silence that followed my statement was absolute. It was heavier and more profound than the shouting that had preceded it. It was the sound of a carefully constructed reality shattering into a million pieces. Isabella's jaw was slack. Her face, which had been flushed with righteous indignation, was now draining of all color, leaving behind a pale, waxy sheen under the chandelier's light. What? She whispered, the word barely audible. What are you talking about? Richard was the first to move. He slowly lowered himself back into his chair, his eyes, trained by decades of discerning truth from fiction, fixed on me with a new, intense clarity. Antonia, he said, his voice quiet but resonant. Are you saying you have the necklace secured? I am, I replied calmly. The estate is still in the final phases of being settled. According to the will, all major assets had to be professionally valued for tax purposes. I informed both you and Margaret via a formal letter at the time, as required by law. Perhaps with everything going on, you forgot. Margaret's hands flew to her mouth, her eyes wide. Oh, my goodness, the letter. Yes, I remember a large envelope. I think I put it on the desk, Richard. Did you see it? Richard shook his head, looking troubled. I can't recall, but that's not the point. An executor's notice is standard procedure. He turned his gaze, now hard as granite, upon his daughter. The point, Isabella, is that Antonia was performing her legal duty. Isabella was floundering, desperately searching for a foothold on the crumbling cliff of her own making. A letter, that's it. How do we know she's telling the truth? She could have written that herself. Where is this so-called paperwork? She demanded, her voice regaining a sliver of its earlier shrillness. That's an excellent question, I said, rising from my chair. I glanced at my husband, David, whose expression was a mixture of relief and dawning fury at his sister. He gave me a small, supportive nod. If you'll all excuse me for one moment. I walked out of the dining room, my heels clicking purposefully on the polished floor. I could feel their eyes on my back. I went to the hall closet, retrieved my coat, and took the keys to my car. My briefcase was on the passenger seat. I had brought it with me for a completely unrelated reason. I had a meeting early the next morning and wanted to review some files after dinner. But now it felt like an act of providence. Inside was the folder containing all the documents related to the estate. When I returned to the dining room, the scene was unchanged. They were all exactly as I had left them, a tableau of suspended animation. I placed my leather briefcase on the empty space at the end of the dining table and clicked open the latches. The sound seemed to echo in the silent room. I pulled out a thick file folder and opened it. "I believe you'll find everything in order," I said, my voice as neutral as if I were presenting a financial report to a client. I laid the first document on the table, turning it so my father-in-law could read it. "This is the official appraisal from a certified gemologist. As you can see, your grandmother's necklace was valued at a significantly higher amount than any of us anticipated." Next, I laid down the receipt. "This is the signed and dated receipt from the bank for the safe deposit box, listing the necklace as the sole content." Finally, I took out a crisp, multi-page document bound in a light blue cover. "And this," I said, my voice softening just a little, "is a certified copy of your grandmother's last will and testament." Richard picked up the will, his movements slow and deliberate. He didn't need to read the whole thing. He was a lawyer. He knew where to look. He flipped to the section detailing the distribution of personal effects. David, Margaret, and even Isabella crowded behind him, airing over his shoulder. I didn't need to see it. I knew the words by heart. I watched Isabella's face as her eyes scanned the page. I saw the moment she found the relevant clause, the moment her last shred of hope turned to ash. Her eyes widened, a flicker of pure, unadulterated disbelief crossing her features before being replaced by a stark, ugly realization. The trap hadn't just closed. It had never been a trap for me at all. It was a mirror she had sprinted towards, and the impact was devastating. Richard read the clause aloud, his voice devoid of emotion, letting the words of his late mother deliver the final, crushing blow. "My sapphire necklace," he read, "is not to be given to any single heir. It is my express wish that, upon my passing, the necklace be held in trust by my executor for a period of 5 years. After such time, it is to be sold at auction, with the full proceeds donated to the University Music Scholarship Fund I established in my husband's memory." He placed the document back on the table with a quiet finality. The necklace was never going to be Isabella's. It was never going to be Margaret's to give. It was destined for a purpose far greater than adorning the neck of a greedy granddaughter at a dinner party. All of Isabella's scheming, her manufactured drama, her cruel and calculated accusation, it was all for nothing. Isabella stumbled back from the table as if struck. "No," she breathed. "No, that can't be right. Grandma promised me. She said one day it would be mine." Margaret shook her head sadly, tears welling in her eyes. "Oh, Isabella, she never promised you that. She said you admired it. Your grandmother was very precise with her words. You heard what you wanted to hear." The full weight of her public humiliations settled upon Isabella. In a room with a retired judge, a meticulous CPA, and her own heartbroken parents, there was no room left for lies. Her entire attack had been predicated on the idea that the necklace was hers by right and that I had stolen it from her. The truth was not just that I hadn't stolen it, but that it was never hers to begin with. Her motive was laid bare for all to see, pure, unadulterated greed. "So you knew," she finally said, her voice a venomous hiss directed at me. "You knew all along. You let me go on. You sat there and let me make a fool of myself." "You did that all on your own, Isabella," David said, his voice cold. He stepped to my side and put his arm around my shoulders, a solid wall of support. "Antonia showed incredible restraint. I'm not sure I would have done the same. She gave you every opportunity to stop, and you just kept digging." Richard looked at his daughter, and for the first time I saw not just anger in his eyes, but a deep, profound disappointment that seemed to age him in an instant. "You have brought shame upon this family tonight," he said, his voice trembling with suppressed rage. "You accused your sister-in-law, a woman who has been nothing but a loyal and loving member of this family, of being a common thief. You did this not out of concern, but out of envy and avarice. You owe her more than an apology. You owe her your shame." Isabella stood there, exposed and defeated. The fight had gone out of her, replaced by a sullen, childish resentment. There were no tears, no remorse, only the quiet fury of being caught. Without another word, she turned, grabbed her purse, and walked out of the dining room, the sound of the front door slamming shut echoing behind her. An uncomfortable silence filled the room. Margaret was openly weeping now, and Richard was comforting her, his own face etched with pain. He looked over at me. "Antonia," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I am so sorry. On behalf of my family, I am deeply, truly sorry for what you were just put through." "There's nothing to apologize for, Richard," I said softly. "You did nothing wrong." In the end, there was no feeling of triumph. There was no joy in watching Isabella's downfall. There was only a quiet, sad vindication. The wound Isabella had tried to inflict upon me had been turned back on herself, and it had severed something in the family. Later that evening, after we had helped clean up and calmed Margaret down, David and I drove home in silence. As we pulled into our driveway, he turned to me, his hand covering mine. "Thank you," he said. I was confused. "For what?" "For being you," he answered. "For being the calm, strong, and honest person you are. My grandmother knew what she was doing when she trusted you." He was right. The grandmother had seen it all coming. She hadn't just left me a legal duty, she had left me a shield. And tonight, I had finally used it. The family dynamic had been irrevocably altered, but my integrity, the very thing Isabella had tried to destroy, remained perfectly intact.